How's it going, everybody? Bryan Alvarez here, After Dark Radio. We are here every Wednesday, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network, twitch.tv/F4W video, video.f4wonline.com on YouTube. And we got an exciting show here today. No guest today. It'll be just myself going solo. Although, I'm sure I will have help from you, dear listener, as we have a lot of ways to contact this show. And as always, I'm looking for your feedback, your stories, etc. But the main topic, at least early on in the show, is a discussion of my trip to see George Noory at the historic Everett Theater in Everett, Washington this past Saturday. I had a great time, and if George is coming to your area, I'm going to tell you what he can look forward to. I presume that he has varied guests for different shows that he does, but I certainly was not expecting what I got. And he did have 3 guests, so we'll talk about those 3 people and some comments, particularly Cliff. I always call him Cliff Barackman. I guess he's Cliff Barrickman. But old Cliff from Finding Bigfoot, who lives in Portland, Boring, Oregon, in fact, which is right outside Portland. He has a Bigfoot museum there. And he was one of the guests, and he had some interesting things to show and say. So we'll talk about that. And also, there was a guest on George's show that I would like to get on this show. And he was discussing AI, so we'll tell you about that here. And then we got a lot of news stories, and on top of news stories, we got your emails as well. You can always email me, Bryan at AfterDarkRadioshow.com. That is Bryan at AfterDarkRadioshow.com, Bryan with a Y. And, you can send me stories on anything. We're always looking for stories about weird things in your hometown, weird things that happened to you, stories your grandparents told you, whatever. Anything weird, I want to hear about it. So send me an email. We'll read some more of those today. You can send your emails at any time. If you're listening to this, not live, for example, you can send those. I keep track of all of them, and I will read everything here on the show. So anything we discuss, anything on your mind, send it to me, Bryan at AfterDarkRadioshow.com. We'll kick it off after the break. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline, Broadcasting Network. Bryan Alvarez here, After Dark Radio, every Wednesday, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern. Sports Byline. Would like to mention you can watch this show on our YouTube channel. which is f4wonline.com/YouTube, or our Twitch channel, which is twitch.tv/f4wvideo. And the show is always free live, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, but you can subscribe to the YouTube page, and basically we have archives of all the shows. You can go back and listen, watch anytime you want. And same with our main site, which is f4wonline.com. And it is a pro wrestling news site, but we do After Dark Radio every week. And there's hundreds of After Dark Radio shows in the archives. So if you're interested or just want to support the show, f4wonline.com or video.f4wonline.com. And if you've never subscribed, we do have a first-time subscriber half-off offer, which is f4wonline.com/new. That's f4wonline.com/new. So check it out, and you can also support the show by buying our new After Dark Radio t-shirt. f4wonline.com/shirts is the address for that, f4wonline.com/shirts. And a lot of wrestling shirts there as well. Somebody always pops into the chat wanting to hear about wrestling, unaware that this is actually a non-wrestling show. So the reason this show exists is because of Art Bell. I grew up listening to Art Bell. I was a huge fan, and I listened to Art Bell religiously in the early 90s. I decided I wanted to do a radio show. Now, around that same time, I also got into wrestling, and so I also wanted to be a wrestler. So as it turned out, I ended up doing a wrestling radio show. All worked out in the end, but I'm a huge fan of Art Bell. And for those of you that remember Art Bell back in the day, he came and went regularly. And eventually, he left the show pretty much permanently and was replaced by George Noory. Okay? George Noory is the current main host of Coast to Coast AM. And, you know, early on, myself and many others, we weren't sold on George because George did have the unfortunate task of having to follow Art Bell. It was just nobody would have sufficed if you were a fan of Art Bell. And you know, over the years, I began to like George. You know, he comes off. He's not Art. If you can accept that George Noory is not Art Bell, and just accept him as being George Noory, you get a lot less upset than if you expect him to replace Art Bell. So, you know, George always came off, I found, as a good-hearted person and a nice guy. He's not Art, but a friendly fella, a nice guy. You know, he has a very different interview. He has a different way of doing interviews from Art. Art certainly was far more dynamic, and George has slowed down here in his later years. He just turned 75, in fact. But I heard that George Noory was going to the historic Everett Theater, which is right up the road from my house, and I put it in the calendar, and I knew, come hell or high water, I was going to this live show. I wanted to see George Noory's live show. So Saturday came, and it was a very busy day, but I found a way, and I made it out there to the theater. So the Everett Historic Theater, it's obviously very old. It doesn't seat like a ton of people. I'd say you could probably get 500 in there. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not very good at judging attendance and that sort of thing. I would say there was probably about, 300 or 400 people showed up for the event. And as soon as I walked in, I sat down, and I was, I think, the youngest person by at least 20 years in that theater. So I don't know where I read about it. Maybe it was a book, maybe it was an article, but it just kind of talked about the dawn of the computer age. You guys, some of you are old like me. Some of you don't even remember this sort of thing. But, you know, I was there early on. I had a Tandy back in the day. And, you know, there was IBM PCs, and there were Macs, which became Apple. And you had Steve Jobs and, I just blanked on his name. But anyway, two guys here. And the fact is, like, they both were exactly the same age. And, it's because people, like, get into certain things when they're young, and there's new technologies, etc. And so, like, all of the people in this, all of the founders of all of these companies were all basically, like, the same age. So, George Noory, he's here as the spiritual successor to Art Bell. And, most of the people in this historic theater, I mean, they were listening to Art Bell in the early 90s, and they were probably in their 30s at the time. I must have got into it when I was much younger than most of them, because it's like all of the same people that listened to Art Bell in the early 90s were here at the Everett Historic Theater. They're all in their 60s and 70s, and George is up there, and he's 75. And, I mean, there was nobody my age there. There was certainly nobody younger than me. So George is out there, got his black suit on, purple shirt, and he's like a guy you'd see, an old crooner in Vegas or something. I mean, jet black hair, jet black mustache. He's got his nice suit on, and it's like a time machine thing. It was like I was in Vegas in the early 90s watching somebody perform. But George comes out, and I'm already like, what are we going to do for this live show? Like, you going to talk about your experiences? You're going to have some people. I knew there were going to be some guests or whatever. So George comes out, and he looks around. He says, hello, everybody. And then he goes, did you guys hear that couple arguing before the show started? I was like, what? And he then breaks up into a stand-up comedy routine. There's an old man and an old woman were arguing by the door, he says. And he's got this joke about how the old lady said, if I die, are you going to have this lady move in? And the guy goes, don't know. Why are you asking me that question? That's ridiculous. And she goes, if I die, is she going to move into my room? And he says, why are you asking me this? I don't want to talk about this. What are we doing? She goes, if I die, will she move into my bed? And he says, I don't know why you're asking me this. This is ridiculous. I don't want to talk about it. It's something. She goes, if I die, will she move into the room and sleep in my bed and use my golf clubs? And he goes, no, she's left-handed. And everyone goes, ha, 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 ha. I was like, what is happening here? So then, I'm like, okay, let's get this first guest out here. We've done some stand-up comedy. Let's get some guests out here. So then George says, well, I'm going to begin with a song. I said, huh? He proceeds to take his microphone, and they got a guy there. He's got like a piano off to the side. This guy starts playing I Can't Help Falling in Love by Elvis Presley. And George Noory starts singing. And he crooned an Elvis song. And like there's all these old ladies in the crowd and they're swooning. I was like, oh my God, what is happening here? And George sang Elvis. And over the course of the next 3 hours, he sang Elvis, he sang Sinatra, he sang When I Fall in Love by Nat King Cole, and he sang Love Me With All of Your Heart by, of all people, Engelbert Humperdinck. Sang him like he was in concert. It wasn't some comedy thing or anything. He sang like it was like a Vegas show. I was like, oh my God, I cannot believe what I'm seeing. So he sang his songs throughout the evening. There was a 20-minute intermission, at which point there was a brisket place next door. I got some brisket. And then I went around looking for, was there a convenience store? I wanted to get like a protein shake and an apple. This place charged me $4.29 for an apple, one apple. Yeah, here in Everett. And that was like and then at the end of the show, they had a meet and greet. And, you know, I didn't know they were going to do a meet and greet. I thought it was just going to be 3 hours and he was done. Well, apparently he did a meet and greet. And, like, the line for the meet and greet was, like, out the front door of this is at the end of the show, not the beginning. It was out the front door, and then you had to go wrap around, and then it went all the way upstairs and around to get to George. And I was like, I can't stay for this one. But it was incredible. And then he had 3 guests. So we're going to talk about these guests and what they talked about after the break. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. And that's I Can't Help Falling in Love with You by George Noory here on After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. It's 2:25 in the morning. Anyway, someone asked here, like, was this like a coast? Was it billed as Coast to Coast or what was it? This was billed as Tommy D Entertainment presents George Noory Live. And boy, was it ever. George Noory Live. And then someone said, did he bust into magic tricks? I wish, dude. If he would have busted into magic tricks, I'd be following this guy around the country watching this live show. So anyway, he had some guests, and the first guest was this fella, Frank Joseph Hoff, who talked about the lost city of Atlantis. And he seemed a little nervous. I think he said it was off the coast of Indonesia or something like that. But I wasn't really all that into that one, I won't lie. I'm not really into the Atlantis thing. So I was, I was mostly marveling at that point, like, at what I was seeing. So the second guest was Matthew James Bailey, who was an AI cosmologist. And this guy, I want to get on this show. He was great. So it's funny because I mentioned, everyone in this audience is old. And this guy starts out by going, anybody here know anything about AI? Raise your hand. And like 3 people raise their hand. And he goes, anybody confused about AI? And like everybody puts their hand in the air. And so this is Coast to Coast AM. George Noory's Coast to Coast AM. And you know how things are on a show like that. You would presume that a guest coming on talking about AI would be doing the entire gloom and doom, and it's going to lead to the end of the world, and it's, et cetera, et cetera. Total opposite this guy. This guy was all in on AI, but in an intelligent way. He wasn't, he was a guy who was deeply involved, and, he saw potential dangers. There are, of course, with any new technology. But essentially, he saw AI as something that ultimately is going to make all of our lives better. If you look at any new technology that there has ever been, there were arguments about, doom when the printing press was invented. There's always fear of the unknown. There's always fears of new technology. But at the end of the day, for the most part, new technology always benefits humanity. And he feels it will be the same way. There's obviously things that we need to be mindful of. But he thinks that at the end of the day, AI is probably going to greatly help humanity. And there were a lot of good questions. They were asking him questions like, is this going to just replace all jobs? And his answer was, well, no. Some jobs will be replaced. But, many jobs have already been replaced by computers long before there was AI. But he said, what AI is going to do is going to make the job that you currently have easier for you. You will still have a job, but it will allow you to, have less stress. When talking about, like, are robots going to take over? No, the robots will be there to help you do the job. But the job is going to require you. And then, there were a lot of questions. Somebody asked about, there was allegedly an incident where, 2 AI computers invented a language and began talking to each other. And the people involved had no idea what these 2 machines were saying to each other. And so they had to unplug them or whatever. And, he said, well, that is a story. And believe it or not, the story is true. But he said, what actually happened was, when you hear a story like that, well, there's 2 AI computers. They create a language that only the 2 of them know, and they start discussing things with each other. Well, your first thought is, oh my God, they're conspiring to destroy humanity. You're thinking about the worst possible thing. And what he said was that what they were actually doing was, in an effort to be, what would be the term? In an effort to be more efficient, they had created their own language to speed the efficiency of their communications with each other for whatever task they were told to do. And he said, well, but we couldn't understand what they were saying, so obviously, we couldn't just let it continue on. But, he said there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of concern, but ultimately this is going to be a benefit to humanity. And I would like to get this guy on the show because this guy, sometimes you hear a guest on this show or other shows, sometimes you hear the guess and you're like, huh, what's this guy talking about? Or he says something that you just know is not true or whatever. And then sometimes you got to guess and you're like, this dude is smart. And that's what I got out of this fella here. He knew his stuff when it came to AI and where he thinks it's going. So I would love to get him, Matthew James Bailey, here on the show. And then the last guest, after my $4 apple, was Cliff of Finding Bigfoot fame. And Cliff lives in Boring, Oregon. Actually, I don't know where he lives. He might live in Portland. But he's got a Bigfoot museum that he runs with his wife in Boring, Oregon. And so he was local. And so he came up here for this event. He was the main event. And sadly, they only got about a half hour with Cliff. Some of the other, I think the Atlantis guest felt like he got like 45 minutes, and the AI guest got a lot of time. But Cliff only got about a half hour, probably because he was contracted for a half hour. But, I thought it was somewhat interesting. I like Cliff. So the thing, if you ever watched Finding Bigfoot, is Cliff was the guy who, no matter what, he believed it had to be Bigfoot. That was his guy. That was the role in the show. You had Bobo, who was the guy that you thought was stoned all the time, even though he wasn't. He was just Bobo. And then you had Cliff, who was like, no matter what, that's for sure Bigfoot. And then you had Matt Moneymaker, the leader of the BFRO, who was just kind of, he was just like out of his mind. And then you had Renee, who was the scientist, who was always skeptical of everything. So anyway, in real life, Cliff isn't, everything's a Bigfoot, but that was his role on the show. And so, but some things he is definitely a believer. We'll put it that way. So, George at one point, they're talking about, he goes, I got a bunch of stuff here in this bag. And George is concerned that it's Bigfoot scat. And Cliff goes, well, I guess we should just start with this then. And, well, actually, first he brought out a footprint from the actual Patterson-Gimlin film. So everyone's seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, in 1967, Bigfoot runs across the thing, whatever, it's famous. One of the most famous films of all time, actually. And that's not just me saying that. Like, if you look at the most famous film footage, not like movies or anything like that, but like it's JFK assassination, Patterson-Gimlin film. I mean, it's one of the most famous films of all time. And it wasn't just filmed, but, I mean, there were actual tracks and everything. And so he had a plaster cast of the track. And, of course, George's question was, well, aren't there people out there faking tracks? And Cliff said, well, of course. I mean, there's always people going out trying to fake Bigfoot tracks. But his argument was that if you've been doing this a long time and you've got a collection of tracks and you've investigated this, he goes, it is so easy to determine a real track from a fake track. And apparently, I'm not the guy to talk to, but the footprint experts, I mean, the best casts have got like anatomical details that would be very, very difficult to fake if you were just making a big piece of wood that looks like a foot and stomping around with it on your foot in the forest. I mean, they've got dermal ridges. They've got, like on your fingerprints, they got those on the toes, which you have as well. I mean, all sorts of things, and you can arches. You can see which way there's all sorts of stuff, but. He said that it's very easy to spot a fake amongst the ones that we believe are real. And so then he pulls out this big, round plaster cast, okay? It's like this big. It's 3 times the size of my head. And George goes, what is that? And Cliff goes, this is a Bigfoot butt print. He's got a plaster cast of a Bigfoot butt print. At which point, George got very excited to handle this butt. So, Cliff tells a story, and there was some guy saw the Bigfoot there. It left. It had been sitting down. He did a cast of the butt, and then he goes into great anatomical, He goes, your own butt. And he starts explaining what your butt actually looks like. And he goes, if your butt had hair, and he's like, all this, and it's like, you know, all of this is visible in the Bigfoot butt print. And he goes, you know, these are very rare, these butt casts, but they are out there. And there's actually a famous Bigfoot body cast. I think it's a Skookum cast. This is clearly a cliffhanger moment here, so to speak. We'll talk about that after the break. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. The Skookum cast is essentially, allegedly, you got the plaster cast of the Bigfoot footprints. We got the cast of the alleged Bigfoot butt. And the Skookum cast is the alleged cast of a entire body. So allegedly, you know, this Bigfoot had been laying on its side on its elbow, eating or whatever. And actually, whenever you go to the zoo, like, apes sit like that all the time. They kind of lay sideways on their elbow and eat or whatever, look around. And so they got this gigantic body cast, which they believe is the cast of where a Bigfoot laid on its side, on its elbow, was eating or whatever, and then left. So obviously, this has been investigated, and the primary alternate hypothesis, obviously, is that it's an elk print. Okay, it was an elk that laid down, and Cliff. I mean, there were a few things. I mean, number one, yes, there was some elk hair found. There was also some other hair that was unidentified that was found, and there were no hoof prints found. And of course, elks have hooves. And most people presume, well, it was probably an elk. It may have been an elk. Cliff's argument is that, in fact, what we did was we took this cast and we showed it to elk experts. And the elk experts were the ones who said that is not an elk. So he says, like, everybody who wants to, disprove Bigfoot, they claim it's an elk. But if you actually ask the people who are experts in elk and elk behavior, they will say that's not the cast of an elk. So anyway, that's the Skookum cast. But he had the butt cast, which he showed. And then, they eventually went to the Q&A. And, there were the usual questions. But then somebody asked what I thought was, that's a good question. And the question was basically, well, early on, George had asked, how many Bigfoot do you believe if there's a Bigfoot, how many are there in all of North America? And Cliff said, well, North America would include, the U.S. and Canada, and obviously Mexico, but there's not a lot of Bigfoot reports in Mexico. But, if you look at Canada, I mean, there's so much empty space in Canada. And he claimed, we estimate between 500 and 1,000 Bigfoot throughout North America. And, at first George is like, wow, that's a lot. And then Cliff is like, actually, that's almost none. It's very, very few when you look at the size. And he said that, the estimates, people very rarely see black bear. I mean, you see them, but it's not like, And he says it would be one Bigfoot for every 200 black bear in all of North America. And so somebody in the Q&A says, well, if Bigfoot is a predator, which, of course, we don't know. We don't even know if Bigfoot exists, and if it does, we don't know anything about it. But he goes, if Bigfoot is a predator, because, of course, there have been stories of, Bigfoot eating elk, in fact, and other small animals, an omnivore at, perhaps. But the question is, if it's a predator, if it's an alpha predator, why would the numbers be so low? They have no natural predators. Nobody's going to be out there to kill them. Why would numbers be so low? And, if they are, constantly procreating, like where are they? Where do they go? He asked. So I think he was trying to suggest, well, these probably aren't animals. This might be some sort of paranormal entity or whatever. And Cliff does not believe for a second that there is anything paranormal about Bigfoot. He believes it's an ape. Case closed. And someone asked him about that too. They go, some Bigfoot researchers believe there's a paranormal aspect to Bigfoot, and he goes, yeah, well, there's not. And they said, well, there are all these stories, and he goes, well, yeah, there's stories about paranormal activity involving all sorts of animals. Like the Native Americans attributed paranormal, to deer. And to other animals. He goes, if there's an animal, somebody has attributed paranormal powers to it. Doesn't mean those are real. So anyway, he believes it's an ape. So the guy, he's trying to ask where do they go, et cetera, et cetera. And so Cliff actually had no answer. He had no good answer to this question. He didn't just say, I don't have an answer. I mean, he went and started talking about something totally unrelated. He didn't answer the guy's question. But I remember, that's a good question. Why would there be so few if they have no natural predators? They're big. I mean, it just seems kind of odd. So I got another buddy that's into Bigfoot, and I brought up this question. And he said, well, Jeff Meldrum's claim is that Bigfoot are not like rabbits. They're not constantly having babies. He goes, the theory is that the birth of a Bigfoot would be a very rare activity, like every 8 to 10 years. And, not everyone is going to survive. So, because of that, regardless of whether it's a natural predator, top of the food chain, whatever, it doesn't matter. The births are such rare events that numbers are kept low. And it was pointed out that chimpanzees, who are one of our closest relatives, they also only give birth every 8 to 10 years. And so, chimps also, it's a big deal when a new chimp is born. And, a lot of alleged Bigfoot behavior. I mean, just like in the last couple of weeks, a buddy of mine sent me some articles. They just discovered new behaviors. I think it was actually wood knocks. We talked about it here on this show. They actually documented apes communicating by whacking on trees. And I was like, what? This is like recent, like 2 weeks ago. So anyway, that was the argument about why, there aren't more. Just like another ape, they don't have babies all that often. So anyway, he answered questions for a while, and then they packed up the butt, and he got out of there. But I thought that Cliff did a good job. I would have liked to have seen more, but overall, I thought that he did a good job answering questions. Only 30 minutes is noted, but I am going to have to head down to Boring, Oregon, and go to his museum. I didn't get a chance to ask the question I wanted to ask because they were limited on time, but I wanted to ask his thoughts because I've gone to there's Bigfoot events all over the place here, so I go to some every now and then. And I did have that one time where I got like a private viewing because like nobody else showed up. They didn't know. It's like they sequestered this guy away in a tent, way away from everything else, and no one else knew to go there. So I was the only one there. And so he opened up his laptop and he goes, "Let me show you some stuff." And he starts showing me all these pictures, and like there were some amazing pictures that this guy had, and he swore they were not AI. And he goes, some of the best pictures they're never made public. They're just passed around amongst Bigfoot researchers because, the researchers they're researching. And, they're not trying to prove anything to each other. They all believe. And so they get good pictures. They send them around to each other, but it doesn't go out into the public because, it's the same thing with UFOs and any photo of anything. If you took a picture of a dinosaur, you're in Africa and you see a dinosaur, you take a picture of it. It's like there's only two options. If the picture sucks, it could be anything. But if the picture's too good, it's got to be fake. So what's the point if you got a great picture that you've personally taken of Bigfoot? If you're one of these researchers, he tells me, what's the point of making it public? No one's going to believe it anyway. So we just pass it around amongst ourselves. So I wanted to ask Cliff, do you got any pictures that aren't made public here? Obviously, he wasn't going to show any, but I wanted to confirm that guy's story, that these researchers pass all these photos around. So anyway, it was a fun time, and I would recommend, if you get a chance to go to a George Noory live show. I mean, if you're a fan of Coast to Coast, how could you not? I think tickets, the cheapest tickets were $40. I think, if you wanted to get first few rows at the Everett Historic Theater, it was like $100. But not exorbitant, especially if you go to WWE shows. So I had a good time. I'm glad I went. Would have liked to have met old George Noory while he's still touring. But, yeah. This person says, get Cliff on After Dark. I feel like he's been on. When we did the show the first time, like a decade ago, I'm pretty sure. I wonder if I could actually look in the archives right now and find it. I'm pretty sure we've got a show with Cliff in the archives. Maybe we haven't. If we haven't, I need to get on that one. I'll bet if I went to his museum and he was there, I could talk him into doing the podcast. Let's check the podcast search here. I could search are there any wrestlers named Cliff? All right, let's search. See if I spell his name right. See if anything comes up when I search that. No. So maybe I haven't had him on the show. Golly, I need to get him on. But I would need to get him on like some show where we could go a long time because I got a lot of questions for that guy. But anyway, that is a story of that. So I wanted to mention one other thing here, a story I read this week, because somebody in the chat had been talking about they want a show on disappearances. And we've had people on talking about like disappearances in the woods and national parks, but I think they're talking more about, what's the story with like the Bermuda Triangle, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I saw this, just came out this week. It was a story from sfgate.com, which I presume is San Francisco. He claimed there was a secret tunnel in Mount Shasta, and then he disappeared. There have been a lot of stories about Mount Shasta over the years. A lot of Mount Shasta legends. It says here, in 1934, at the foot of Northern California's towering Mount Shasta, a geologist named J.C. Brown started telling a captivating story to anyone who would listen. He spoke of an 11-mile tunnel filled with gold and giant skeletons, and said it led straight to the heart of Mount Shasta, an active volcano. Lots of people believed Brown, and soon he was organizing an expedition into the tunnel. But it never happened. Instead, mere days before the expedition was scheduled to depart, Brown mysteriously disappeared without a trace. His story of the treasure-filled tunnel, however, has endured. Like any good urban legend, it was just close enough to the truth to make it believable. And so they've got a whole story on this here. And what's funny is, this story about giant skeletons and gold in Mount Shasta is actually very, very similar to another story that was told about gold and mummies, etc., in the Grand Canyon. And that was a story that I think came out in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Some fella named Kincaid, I believe was his name, had allegedly discovered this like secret cave in the Grand Canyon that was filled with all of these Egyptian artifacts and mummies and gold, and allegedly like these trucks came and took everything to the Smithsonian. And it was one of those stories from back in the day that these newspapers needed to make up stories to sell. Totally made up story, but very similar to this alleged story in Mount Shasta. So my guess is nothing to it, but certainly there have been many stories over the years about Mount Shasta. Back in a moment with more After Dark Radio Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. Alvarez here, After Dark Radio. Fella here wants a show on D.B. Cooper. That seems like a show we could do monthly, because, like, every month there's allegedly a new discovery of who D.B. Cooper was. At this point, I'm not sure we're ever going to know. But I think it's the, what the heck is that? Seattle Historical Museum. There's a museum in Seattle, and they had a... I forget what exactly it was. It was some exhibit that I took the kids to. And... God, I cannot remember what it was. But it had like a bunch of stuff from like the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And might have been a toy fair or something like that. But anyway, I just remember because there was like a bunch of stuff from the 70s. And like I was born in the 70s. And this stuff, it should be like in a museum. So I felt like I should be in a museum. But anyway, on the way out, like the museum was hosting this thing. So you had to go in the back and then they had the whole area set up for whatever the exhibit was. So on the way out, I'm looking at like some of the other exhibits as we're leaving. And I walk around this corner and holy smokes, there's a parachute. And it wasn't one of D.B. Cooper's parachutes, but it was a parachute from the actual hijacked plane. So, you know, there are like a bunch of different parachutes in the plane or whatever, and he took like one or two or whatever he took when he jumped out. And one of the remaining ones they had put up for display here in this, and they had a whole area for the D.B. Cooper display in this museum. And it was pretty cool. So I got a chance to see one of the actual parachutes in the actual plane that D.B. Cooper jumped out of. And someday I got to talk more about D.B. Cooper because it's amazing this story to this day is like still such a big thing. Because at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, there were like 170 hijackings a year in the U.S. 170 a year. It was like one every other day. I mean, people hijack planes all the time. But that's the one that has lasted to this day. We're out of time. Thank you all for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. After Dark Radio Sports Byline Broadcasting Network.